All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Manal Elkarra. I am honored to be the co-host of today's webinar with Dr. Rupa Marya and the Do No Harm Coalition. I'm a family medicine and lifestyle medicine doctor here in San Francisco, the city where I was born and raised. My family is from the Gaza Strip, Palestine. I'm passionate about the intersection of social justice, global health, and food as medicine. And we are joined with our amazing guests today as we discuss food as medicine and food as a weapon, and the critical need for reclaiming indigenous food systems and mobilizing support for unrestricted aid for Gaza. We'll begin with introductions, and then a brief update of the current situation, and then the health impacts of food system disruption in Palestine since the Israeli occupation. So I'll hand it off to Dr. Rupa Marya.
Hello, everybody. I'm so honored and grateful to be here with these just incredible sisters who are going to have just such a stimulating conversation about the things that we work in, the ways that we organize to support our communities who are experiencing such a crushing reality under the heel of colonial capitalism. And we're seeing it really rear its ugly face right now in such a devastating way. I am a professor of medicine at UCSF. I am an activist and artist, and now one of the founders of the Deep Medicine Circle, an organization that's working in Ohlone country to return land and build a vision of the food system based in care and wellness for everybody. So I'm grateful to be here with my dear friend Rowen, who I will pass it off to now.
Greetings, relatives. My name is Rowen White. I come from a small community that actually straddles an international border. Our community is called Akwesasne, which is a Mohawk community. Half of our reserve is in Canada, so-called Canada, and half is in New York State. So we have a highly militarized police state right around our reserve. And I've been involved in Indigenous food sovereignty movement, largely around advocacy for the restoration of relationships between people and their seeds for 25 plus years. I come from a long line of agriculturalists and ancestors who've had deep connection to the land. I currently serve as the creative director for CR Seeds, which is our Indigenous seed bank, farm, educational living classroom here in the Sierra foothills of Northern California, and have raised my children in our traditional life ways. They're 18 and 16. And also I'm the founder of the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is a international, intertribal organization, grassroots organization entity that's focused on uplifting and empowering those of us who are carrying the ancestral bundles of seed from our communities and working towards dignified resurgence in cultural, spiritual connections to our seeds, to our land, to our landscapes of nourishment. So I feel really honored to be here as a part of this conversation in this intercultural collaboration. So thank you, Rupa, for inviting me. I'll pass it over.
Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday. So blessed to be in this space with you all. My name is Reem Assil. I'm a Oakland and San Francisco based Palestinian Syrian chef. I am the owner of Reem's California, which is an Arab bakery and restaurant. And our mission is to really build community across cultures and experiences through the warmth of Arab bread and hospitality. And so food has always been a vehicle for me in my life, but in the professional sense for the last almost 15 years now. It's crazy. And once an organizer, always an organizer, but professionally prior to being a baker, I was on the front lines with various Black and Brown communities fighting for their voice in their neighborhoods and on their jobs, really to have self-determination and a say in the decisions that people in power were making to impact their lives. And so I bring that ethos into everything I do. Food is very political for me. And I'm also a member leader of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and really committed to empowering Arabs here all the way to the homeland to live in dignity and self-determination. And so the work that I do in food is very integral to that piece of the work. So I'm excited to add a layer of conversation around food and how I got into it and how it all connects.
Before we go on, Manal, I just wanted to offer to people, we have disabled the chat, but the Q&A is live, and we will be taking questions from you all in the Q&A. We will not be answering raised hands. So if you have a question, throw it in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to it either by typing or by directly responding. All right, Manal, go for it. Thank you.
Thank you both for the introductions. What I'd like to take a few minutes to do is just give a very brief introduction, history of the situation in Gaza. So in 1948, with the creation of the state of Israel, tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed, almost 1 million were made refugees, forced out of their homes and made refugees internally. So they were internally displaced in other parts of Palestine, as well as in other refugee camps across the Middle East. Over 500 Palestinian towns were completely destroyed. This event was called the Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe. And right now, Palestinians are experiencing another catastrophe, another Nakba. The numbers as of now are more than 30,000 killed, 10,000 of them children, almost 2 million internally displaced, more than 52,000 injured. We know that more than almost 500 healthcare workers have been targeted, with more than 200 of them killed. You know, there have been more than 131 healthcare facilities that have also been targeted. Palestinians right now in Gaza are being denied basic human rights, no access to clean water. They are being denied access to food, electricity, and fuel. We now have reports of Palestinians in Gaza starving to death. And to give you a little, picture of Gaza, it is about 25 miles long and 3 to 7 miles wide in some parts. It is one of the most densely populated places in the world. There are 8 different refugee camps there, and 80% of the population of more than 2 million people are refugees. The Gaza Strip was controlled by Egypt after the 1948 war, and then captured and occupied by Israel in 1967. We're going to fast forward a little bit to the blockade, which a lot of us are hearing about. So a temporary Israeli blockade began in 2005, with a permanent blockade in place in 2007. The United Nations, the Red Cross, and numerous international organizations consider the Gaza Strip to be under Israeli military occupation. Some of you may have heard the term that Gaza Strip is an open air prison. What does that mean? It's land, its sea, and airspace is all under a blockade. Palestinians do not have control of this part of their environment. This is kind of a quick recap of what's happening. I'd like to share a little about the blockade. So the blockade that began in 2007 meant that there's no exports, very limited imports. Certain Israeli imports were permitted. And so what happened since 2007, we have this region that's very fertile. And Reem and I later will talk about the history of Gaza as a place that was on the route of the incense road, the incense trade routes. It is a history of abundance through many different periods in history. And what this blockade has basically done is deprived Palestinians in Gaza from their livelihoods, which is tending to the land, tending to the earth, even the fish. They are denied fishing, even in the Mediterranean Sea. So before 2007, if we compare to the export level more recently, it was less than 2% of what it was before. So you can imagine the catastrophic effects of this. And what Gaza then became is a place where there's chronic needs, dependency on donors, and essentially a de-development. of the whole Gaza Strip. And the IDF policy, which stands for the Israeli Defense Forces, and some we'll call the Israeli Occupation Forces, in their own words, what they wanted for Gaza was no development, no prosperity, and no humanitarian crisis. So what does that mean? That they didn't want a humanitarian crisis. During this time of the blockade, the caloric needs of Palestinians were measured, and Israel's policy was to limit how much food would be entered into Gaza, but just enough so that for the international, we'll say, entities that would not be considered that they were starving. So they would calculate the number of calories to avoid officially malnutrition under its blockade. And this report was actually published by Gisha, which is an Israeli human rights group, back in 2008. So this is the unfortunate situation which we've been in since. And Israel, as the occupying power by international law, it has to ensure that the basic needs are met of those that it occupies. And those basic needs are not met, have not been met for decades. We have things like the United Nations, the UNRWA, which do handouts such as rice, flour, cooking oil. But as we will learn later on this show, our food is so much more than that. And we have an abundance of so many other types of food in the Gaza Strip. Food is an expression of so much for us as Palestinians and for everyone across the world. Food is a part of our heritage, is a part of our culture, it's a part of our history. And with that, I'd like to ask Reem, in your work as a Palestinian chef, two questions that, we want to talk about food as central to our Palestinian identity and our culture. And the second part is how that relates to how food is being weaponized.
Thank you so much for laying all of that groundwork. I think, sometimes we talk about these things in theory, but when we actually really look at the numbers, and to know that we're watching idly by, as we're watching this man-made catastrophe happen, it's daunting. In terms of your question, I'll start with kind of food as a human right, because I think it's not unique to Palestinians. Food is a human right, right? The idea that we fight for food sovereignty, right? The concept of that is that every human being has the right to have access to their food in culturally appropriate ways, from their land. Their self-determination actually depends on it, right? So the very right to actually have access to your land, to grow the food that is culturally relevant to you, that connects you to a lineage, is a human right. And that is a right that has been taken from the very inception of Israel as a state. You can see where the land grabs are, that the idea is to take as much of the fertile ground possible with as little Palestinians as possible on it, right? For the settler colonial state. So already in the way that the Israel was set up, it was to do that, right? And so part of that is kind of, as you alluded to take us away from our livelihood, but it's also a way to sever us from our culture, to break our spirits, right? In the West Bank, it is not by coincidence that they're taking all of the arid land, all of the land that you can farm off of, right? That's the first thing they target, are olive trees, right? Which have years and years of history. It takes 40 years to grow a mature olive tree. That's our history. So they're not just going for these things to cut us off from actual food, but it's to sever us from a lineage. And that is part of the playbook for settler colonialism, right? Is to create that myth of a land without a people for a people without a land, right? Or in the case of here in Turtle Island, uh-oh. Are y'all still on? It says that I've been signed out. Okay. A land without a people for a people without a land, right? it's part of that cultural erasure, right? So that one day, years like that Palestinians didn't exist, right? And we can see on the ground that that has not worked. That despite, you know, I mean, we see all these policies. So not being able to grow on our own land, settle, you know, illegal settlements being built on people's farms, making it a crime to forage your own food, right? All of these things are very intentional policies, and yet Palestinians resist, right? I've heard stories in Gaza where like people will go all over just to collect all the ingredients to make an iconic dish called msakhan, which is a Palestinian dish that is really used to celebrate the olive harvest. But unfortunately in Gaza, because they're on a starvation diet, let's call it what it is, you can't have access to olive oil anymore. So people have to go to great lengths to get that, and they are doing it, right? So they are sending, Palestinians on the ground are sending a message loud and clear that you cannot sever us from our lineage. And those in diaspora and those forced who are displaced are taking seed. We're creating seed banks. We're growing seeds in diaspora. So even when we're displaced from our lands, we're carrying that lineage. And I think that's kind of where I see myself in that struggle here in diaspora, which is that, you know, I can cook the foods that my grandmother couldn't cook, right? The dishes of the Mediterranean that are so iconic with Gaza, but that folks in Gaza cannot cook because their waterways are controlled. And to carry that lineage. So the fight for food is really the fight against this playbook of our erasures, so that people will turn a blind eye when this genocide is happening. And that is work that we've done over the course of, you know, since the early 1900s, when we were seeing this displacement happen. And the other thing, obviously, so food is so integral to our culture, but its food is also so integral to our land, right? Our food, we are a rural people. And so as long as we are fighting for food sovereignty, that connects us to the fight for land, right? And keeps us grounded in place. And that's why people resist on the land, despite, you know, being held up against, despite the bombardment, despite the guns, all of the things, people are in these simple acts of resistance. You see that right now in the footage that you're seeing in social media. I mean, bags of flour are now costing like $400, $500. It's crazy. But Palestinians are taking care of one another, and they're going in on those flour, you know, bags of flour together and baking bread and sharing it. We are a communal people. And so as long as we kind of have access to our land and our food, we can stay on our land, right? And so it then becomes a very non-violent act of resistance, even in the face of violence. And so, yeah, I think those two things are very interconnected.
Thank you. And, you know, as we're seeing now as part of this tactic, as you know, labeled it, starvation, you know, starving the indigenous population, it's also bulldozing many of the agricultural lands that are very far away. You know, they're closer to the border. Early on in the first few weeks, I remember people, you know, in my own family going to their farmlands, trying to grab whatever they could. And now, unfortunately, that's also been cut off. So again,
that was always, I mean, they said it, right? The end game of Gaza is to make it unlivable. And if you can sever off people from the land, like that's how we live, right? We live off the land, right? So that's why they're going after the bakeries. That's why they're going after the markets, the farms, all of these things, because that is the way that you make a space livable, right?
And that's the perfect segue to our next question for Rowen, because we have seen this before. With your work as an Indigenous seed keeper here in Turtle Island, what similarities are you noticing between, you know, the tactics that Reem has mentioned, between Israel's tactics in Palestine, you know, acutely and long term?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I can only speak from my own lived experience as one Indigenous woman here on Turtle Island from my own community, but I have the honor and privilege of being able to work alongside people from a multitude of over 560 tribes on this continent who have our own unique foodways and relationships to nourishment. But what I can say is that we do share a common experience under the oppression of the settler colonial project. And I also see those threads, those like tragic threads of connection between us and our Palestinian relatives, people across there. But what I can say is that for me and many of those of us who are working alongside one another in the Indigenous food sovereignty work is that when we look at Palestine and when we look at what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, it's like looking back in time for us as Native people here, because it's the same patterns in history. And what I will also remind folks, which I think we're all getting a greater understanding of, is that settler colonialism is an ongoing project, right? It didn't end for us when my ancestors endured scorched earth tactics. There was, orders in the late 1700s by George Washington to General Sullivan to literally burn down our cornfields as Haudenosaunee people as an act of revenge against us siding with the British in an act of resistance against America being born, right? And so there are directives that are written down in history books that tell about how there was not to be a cornfield spared, that there was not to be a village spared, that there was just going to be complete or scorched earth tactics. And that then was a part of a destabilizing of our food systems to create the colonial dependency, right? And that has been centuries for us of reckoning with the horrific reverberating impacts of that, those initial scorched earth campaigns and then the ongoing ones, right? And that loss of land base, as Reem talked about, and the impacts of that on our relational foodways. Because it's not only just a loss of the land, it's a loss of generational food wisdom. It's the loss of seeds. I think about all the seeds and the plants and those lands that were burnt, and the people that, 90% of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island were decimated in that genocide and continue to die from the impacts of a colonial food system, which I hope we'll get to talk about. But there are these devastating ripples. There has been a weaponizing of seeds and a weaponizing of farming through the government, the US government, and their the way in which the manifest destiny and westward expansionism happened through homestead allotments. So we're seeing, those horrors happening in Palestine as well. And how what I like to uplift in this conversation is how systemic that has become in the ongoing settler colonial project here, and how land grant universities and the USDA are a part of that, how it becomes so systemic. Because when the Homestead Act, in 1862, the USDA was formed, the land grant university under the Morrill Act was put into place, and it was sending citizens of the US, settlers of the US, out into the West and into many Indigenous territories, and giving them seeds and giving them agricultural knowledge as a part of being foot soldiers of the genocide and of the loss of land, across Turtle Island, right? And so these land grabs were a part of corralling Indigenous peoples onto smaller and smaller and smaller reserves, which then creates this situation where, in legal terms in North America, our federally recognized communities, and I use that word because there are many Native communities who are not federally recognized, and that's a whole other issue. but we are considered domestic dependent nations. And so that's so similar to what has been talked about in terms of what is happening in Gaza and the type of like colonial dependency that exists and is systematized in that way. And so I speak to these things because there's so many triggering patterns, so many ways in which that, the loss of land and the loss of our traditional foodways have impacted us, not only on a physical level in the way that we have astounding levels of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, because we've had to eat these commodity foods, right? You were speaking about the blockade and the things that are allowed in. And when we are displaced and dispossessed from our land and from that knowledge and the cultural upheaval of boarding schools and all of the things that come up with the acculturation and assimilation, the ongoing cultural, assimilation of settler colonialism, we lose generations of that with that food wisdom, right? That's passed down from generation to generation. And so our work is really pushing back and educating in our communities about the devastating impacts of those commodity foods and how they are weapons within our community, that when we are corralled into reserves where we don't have access to that land base, which ensures our ability to tend to a landscape of nourishment on our own terms, self-determined with sovereignty, and we're forced to eat these foods that are not made for our bodies, that don't metabolize well physically, but also on a spiritual and cultural level. We have deep, enduring agreements with the land, with the seeds, with the plants, with our more than human relatives. And this is a very manufactured dismantling of all of that in order to basically try and cut us off from our roots. And I hope that we get to, I know we were going to talk more about the acts of resistance, but I will say that whatever they do to burn our cornfields and to move us off of our land, that whatever made us great as Indigenous people still lives in that land and still exists there. And they can never sever that. They can never sever that connection. And Indigenous peoples will continue in any and all means necessary to continue to be in our resistance and our resilience, to continue to connect in deep and powerful ways to that land and to the power that resides inside that land. And that's what gives me hope. And that's what I see in the movement for liberation with Palestinian people. And I see that in them as well. So.
Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. Thank you, Rowen and Reem and Manal. When Reem described colonialism, as the catastrophe that we're seeing as a man-made catastrophe, this starvation in Gaza, it actually is exactly correct that colonialism is a man-made catastrophe, as Rowen was just describing, from settler colonialism here in occupied Turtle Island, to Gaza, to Palestine. But also the extractive version of colonialism that my homeland experienced, where the starvation of our people in these famines were manufactured and created in between 1880 and 1920. Upwards of 100 million, and that's a conservative estimate, of South Asians died from colonial food policies. These policies are created to manufacture as much long-term damage around our bodies. And as a physician, we see that in the manifestation of chronic inflammatory disease. It's not only the eating of commodity foods, as Rowen was mentioning, these things that our bodies can't digest and metabolize that cause damage inside of our bodies, but it's also the structures around us when we don't have access to those fish, when we can't perform the duties of care that we're obliged to for our trees, for these entities and beings that we've had long-standing agreements with in my homeland of Punjab. So I'm diaspora as well. I was born and raised in occupied unceded Ohlone territory. My ancestors are from this very fertile, rich zone in Punjab, this place of 5 rivers, this incredible valley of nutrients that come down from the Himalayas, that has been completely decimated by the industrial agricultural complex advanced by the Rockefeller Foundation with the so-called Green Revolution, which was put forward as a mechanism to bring agriculture into the technological, 20th century, but truly was a form of control. And that we have to understand that controlling food systems and changing them is a critical 101 colonial tactic from the dawn of capitalism in Europe, where the falling feudal society, as it was falling apart, those in charge were trying to figure out how to keep control as the peasants were starting to self-organize in the wake of the Black Death. And one of the ways that they did that was the advent of what is now called capitalism. And one of the first technologies was to enclose the forests and to make them private property. So people no longer had access to, and by people I mean peasants, no longer had access to food, to land, to subsistence farm, to medicines that they got from those forests, or to the wood for shelter. So they made food, medicine, and housing scarce. And that is still the same things that we deal with as healthcare workers, is food, medicine, and shelter being scarce. And what we're seeing in Gaza is just an obscene way of making food, medicine, and shelter, erasing that. It causes catastrophic effects on communities. So then when we understand that this mentality, when we're saying, okay, what's happening here on Turtle Island, was studied by the founders of Zionism. It was studied by Hitler. That these are tactics that were studied and developed through centuries of European colonization, since the 1455, when the Pope declared the right of European kings to conquer other people's lands, to perpetually enslave Saracen or Muslim or Black and brown folks, and to use all that for their personal profit, and so when we understand that architecture of thought is proliferating in all the structures and systems that Rowen just described, from our legal structures to our institutions of medicine, the way that doctors can't even say free Palestine without being, told now that they're being anti-Semitic if they say Palestinians should not be oppressed. We're seeing people being censored in their emails. We're seeing residents being silenced in their presentations. And so this is a very challenging time, but it shows that this resistance is needed more than ever. And what brings me joy and excitement and strength is seeing those acts of care that Reem engages in her food work. So that as you're eating that food, you're internalizing in your body the very act of resistance that has spread through the diasporic tradition here into Oakland and San Francisco, where we're lucky enough to get her food. When we see what Rowen is doing with her seed work and her teaching and her writing, and having a chance to visit her farm up in the foothills of the Sierras, we see that. And down the coast of San Gregorio with the Deep Medicine Circle, I'm sitting here with our Ohlone friends talking about how we're transferring that land back, that land that had been a place of food and medicine for so many generations, for thousands and thousands of years. And as Ohlone people are now starting to come and be present and reconnect with that land, how do we as diasporic people get to reorient ourselves as guests on somebody else's homelands, as we get to benefit from those intercultural exchanges that deepen all of our relationships to the earth. So as I think about all of this, it's important for me to be able to recognize the dynamics of coloniality. I'll hear some people say, oh, but Israel, Jewish people are also indigenous to that area. And it's an interesting moment of watching people weaponize identity, as if to be indigenous was just some sort of like genetic reductionist thing, you could say. But it's a worldview, it's a way of behaving. Claims to indigeneity don't mean you can throw everybody else out of their homes and burn their, olive trees and pour concrete into the agricultural wells or the historic springs, which was just happening in August in 2023 in the West Bank. So those are not ways of behaving that speak to that relationality of ourselves to one another and our duties of care to one another and the earth. And so I think it's important that we're able to understand not only what those patterns are like, but also how they impact health as healthcare workers, because we can't just simply be offering people more and more insulin. We can't just simply be treating obesity like a problem with one individual who just has to diet and exercise better, when the structures around people's are actually engineered to create as much damage as possible. We must get involved in re-engineering those structures. So yeah, so thank you, Manal.
Thank you. I heard a lot of things on what you just said. And one of them is this idea of a shared humanity, an idea of who is Indigenous, an idea of what do borders do for people. And I think for me, being, my family being from the Gaza Strip, and luckily having gone throughout so many different stages of my own life, what borders do is they dehumanize people, because there's a physical border that is not allowing you to know a person who is just like you. And I'll share a story. My grandmother used to tell me before these blockades, and maybe before the first Intifada, where the borders were not what they are today. They were not as militarized. So there was there was more flow back and forth. Jewish Israelis used to come to the markets in the north of Gaza, and they used to shop with Palestinians. My grandmother was a merchant, and she used to take vegetables and other goods and organic cotton, and she used to sell in the market, in the Carmel market in Tel Aviv, which many people might not know was majority Palestinians, merchants in that market. This whole idea of otherizing and dehumanizing, right? And it crosses over completely into this food discussion, right? And this is a question I have for Reem, of course, is this idea of cultural appropriation, this mine versus yours, right? So in our tradition, we don't label a food by its country of origin usually, because our food is also so local. You can have a certain dish in one town, and a few miles away, it will not have been known. I mean, now with social media, everyone knows everything. But I'm talking about traditionally. I mean, it was very unique to different regions. And on that note, we have amazing dishes, not just, of course, in Gaza, all of Palestine. So Reem, if you can share with us a little bit more of this dehumanization with food, and how cultural appropriation is being used to really erase the Palestinian identity.
Yeah, that's so funny. I have like the opposite story, which is like that I think Arabs, particularly those from what we call Greater Syria, where there were no borders before the French and the British came and broke it up, it was much more because it's a human right also to move freely. And Arabs, just by our lineage, we move, right? We are hospitable people. We bring people into our spaces. We go to other, and so the jockeying for ownership is almost kind of comical, because you can have the same dish and it will just move from house to house, even from village to village. Everybody will claim theirs is the original one. So there's no such thing as the authentic, matlube. Like matlube is just the example that I have, which is like iconic Palestinian dish that connects all of us from the diaspora to 1948 to the West Bank to Gaza. But no one matlube is the same, and that's a beautiful thing, right? That kind of idea that we can move and we can adapt, and like you said, it's localized because we live off the land, and we honor the places that we're in and what we can find. And why I think Palestinians who've been forced off their land are so adaptable to where they go. We have that resilience that is a mechanism of our survival as a people. But to kind of answer the question around, so then cultural appropriation almost seems like a too, I guess, deductive of a term, because it's about cultural theft. It's like, sure, yeah, Sephardic Jews who lived in that area make hummus too, but like the fact that you don't call something Palestinian is an intentional thing, right? And why the Israeli government has thrown billions of dollars into what they call gastro diplomacy. It's very intentional, because it's meant to whitewash and to capture the hearts and minds of people, particularly in the West, right? Because Israel depends on the US and the UK primarily as its like biggest funders. So they need people complicit in their narrative that, you know, Israel is this melting pot of all the cultures. Ironically, Palestinians not mentioned, right? But they talk about all the other Arab Jews who've come in and, you know, give it names. And they're like, yeah, there's Palestinian, but we become supporting characters in their narrative, right? And so for me, that's where it's very important to call my food Palestinian, because it's a political identity more than it is anything else, right? Because the reality is that like my food is neither Palestinian or Syrian or Lebanese. It's all the things, right? My parents were forced displaced people, and then they came to the States, and then that food became informed by the places that they were forced into, namely, you know, East Coast, where you don't get the nice tomatoes that you get in Gaza. And then here in California, right, where my food is influenced by the land here, and I want to pay homage to that land. So that claiming of cultural appropriation, almost, I call it I call it theft, right? And it's theft for the intention. It has a very specific intention of, again, going back to that playbook that I was talking about, a land without a people. We just become these supporting characters. Yeah, they were there, and they're just some characters in our story, right? And obfuscating that history, right? And so when
Erasure.
I make, yeah, it's erasure, but it's like, yeah, it's erasure not of our identities, but also that horrible history of how that state came to be, right? When you kind of just call it, it's kind of like here in the US, right? We're this melting pot, right? No, like something happened to create that melting pot, right? We created we first of all genocided the indigenous people here, erased their foodways. Then we went and pillaged the lands of everybody else, and forced those folks in those countries to have to migrate here for more jobs, and then took their labor, you know. So it basically erases the story, and I feel like it's a disingenuous thing to do. So that's what I always like to do, is not talk about ownership of food, but more the story behind the food, to really kind of make people a little bit uncomfortable, right? And ask questions. And I think, you know, where we have power here in the US is to ask these questions. Where do these foods come from? What is the story behind it? Because then it will really impact the way that we spend our money, right? And it all comes down to that, because genocide doesn't happen just because it happens. It happens with our consent, right? And if we don't know the stories behind these foods, then we don't ask questions, right? And then it adds to our cognitive dissonance when we look at dead bodies, right? Dead Palestinian bodies, that we can move on to our next. I just want to feel good, right? I just want to eat food that, like, let's just get around the table and eat some, you know, like it doesn't make us upset. And what I want my food to do is not just make people feel good, but actually touch them in a way where they get upset. I know that sounds weird, right? But like, my food is not just comfort food, it's discomfort food, right? When you know the story behind that food, it should compel you to take action. And that is the work that I do. So whenever I talk about Palestinian ownership, it's a political identity more than anything else. There's an intention behind it. And the last thing I want to say, because I think you alluded to it a little bit, is that these colonizers have the same playbook. What they did here in the US, people don't want to come to terms with all of this because they don't want to come to terms with the history of this country. And so if we solve for Palestine, we're solving for decolonization here in the US. And so it is in our interest as colonized people to share resources, to share tools of resistance, to share histories, because they're really, really one and the same. And the more that we can do that, and the more we can kind of pick at their strategies and their playbook, the more we can solve for decolonization here in the US, because we can't decolonize Palestine without decolonizing here.
Absolutely.
And I think food is such an integral way to do that, because everybody eats. it connects to everybody, right? And so our foodways then become a really, really important tool for the organizing. So I just want to kind of say that. And that's why with Reems, I don't just talk about Palestinian food sovereignty. It's not just about, it's about food sovereignty here in the US, right? And paying homage.
I just want to add one thing in here, which is that I think we oftentimes in Indian countries say that people don't want to talk about Palestine because they can't talk about Wounded Knee, right?
Yep,
And
exactly.
that's like exactly it. And that's like Sean Sherman with Awamni and the sous chef and the work that he's doing in Minneapolis, or other Indigenous chefs across Turtle Island. They're doing it as a political act, right? They're saying this is beautiful, amazing food, and we need to make you a little uncomfortable about the history of why don't you know this food, right? When you live here on this land, right? Yeah.
I actually was going to ask you that question, but you beat me to it. Reem, you said something really important, which is about this playbook, right? So using food as a weapon, starvation. This is not anything new. Rowen mentioned, something, but even taking it to some more recent war, the Iraqi invasion, 2003, the seed bank, Abu Ghraib, people remember Abu Ghraib as this place, horrible prison where, Iraqi prisoners were tortured. Abu Ghraib is, first of all, Iraq, the Fertile Crescent, right? Abu Ghraib is in this delta between, I think it was the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it is where the seed bank was. Thousands and thousands of seeds that are thousands and thousands of years old. These are deliberate attacks. And I love that you said that. This is a part of a playbook, a well-established playbook. Nothing that is happening today in Palestine, it's nothing new. And you both mentioned this too, all of you, is that this colonial settler mentality, it never ended, right? And I think for those who already knew that, we're trudging, we're working along every day or as organizers. And then there's this awakening of people who are just seeing that now, right? And so now there's all this education to that. So remembering those seeds of Abu Ghraib, which, some people were able to rescue some of them. Then they took them to Syria, right? And then after the war there, they took them to the south of Lebanon. I mean, it's a disastrous situation, right? And then what did they do? Also part of the playbook, they made it illegal for people to preserve the seeds. And then they brought in Monsanto and these genetically, these fake seeds that just reproduce in the same way, that don't allow for the change in environment, right? The change in weather, that don't allow for the wisdom of the people who are growing the food and how, and how they work with their seeds. So thank you for bringing that up and how we can relate all these struggles. They're all related. And I want to tie that back, Rowen, as a seed worker, as a person who is so connected to the earth. What are ways of just long-term solidarity that you see from the Indigenous community that can support, rebuilding Palestinians' way of agriculture and land, and ultimately food?
Absolutely. I think continuing to build bridges of solidarity so that we understand our shared experience. What the Colonial Project wants to do is divide and conquer, right? It wants to silo us away and think that our situation is unique. And what they fear the most is that we start to compare stories and say, oh, they did that to us too. And, and so that's what they fear the most, right? And that's what we're seeing right now, is that they're trying to continue to divide us and censor us and not share our story. And how I came into understanding, a greater understanding of what's happening in Palestine, is through a relationship to another Palestinian seed keeper, Vivian Sansour, from the Palestinian Seed Library. And we Mohawks have a long-term partnership in the Hudson Valley with a project called the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, and in a long-term relationship towards rematriation of Indigenous land in that particular valley. And they've also pledged support and created a seed sanctuary for the Palestinian Seed Library and Palestinian refugees who are working in the United States. And so we formed this beautiful relationship together and was able to learn more about this shared experience between us. And so I think the more that we can lean into these intercultural collaborations that are under the shade tree of our gardens, inside of our kitchens, inside of that shared, lived experience, not only to share some of the, to help put bombs on each other's wounds, but also to see a reflection of the resiliency and the resistance, and to strengthen us, right? To continue to strengthen and give us hope, because we're centuries into this, right? We're further down the road. And so in some ways we have things to offer our Palestinian relatives, but we also learn from you, because there's a global solidarity that is growing right now to support Palestinian liberation that we ourselves didn't have, 500 years ago. There were no iPhones, there was no social media, all of that stuff happened. And so I think just continuing to lean into building those intercultural collaborations that are rooted in, I think what I can say is that it's imperative for us to grow a culture capable of raising the next generation of people who are able to listen and cultivate a relationship to those seen and unseen, those living wisdom keepers, and those who have passed on into ancestors, to be able to download the wisdom from our more than human relatives and our existing human relatives, to be able to grow that next generation of cultures of transition, right? Of how do we stand in the face of settler colonialism and say, enough, we're not doing this anymore. And so part of this is working together to build that solidarity of what does it take to create literacy, not only amongst our own communities, and to dismantle the way in which we've been steeped in oppression and internalize that in certain ways in our communities, but to also continue to grow what I call growing the surface area of solidarity with others, to bring them in alongside us to do this work, to grow those cultures of transition that say that we are not participating in the violences of settler colonialism anymore. And that requires those of us who are those of you who are the beneficiaries of settler colonialism. Like, we need you, those of you who are listening, who are the beneficiaries of settler colonialism, as uncomfortable as that is to reckon with. We need you to leverage resource and your privilege to continue to dismantle that violent, ongoing settler colonialism. And that's what the rematriation movement inside Indigenous food sovereignty has offered this intercultural collaboration to say, there has been failures, there has been violences, there has been genocide, but there also is a pathway to healing and reconciliation, right? And there is an opportunity for those of you who have inherited that privilege of the spoils of war and of the spoils of genocide to continue to make amends and to heal and to give back and to work in that way. And that's where I think that when we look at the narrative across mainstream media, and they're saying that free Palestine means an annihilation of another people, and they're just not getting it, is like, what we're saying is that we want to dismantle these systems of oppression that benefit nobody. Not even the people who are the perceived beneficiaries of these systems are beneficiaries of these systems. And so we're saying that we want to dismantle it for the liberation of everybody, right? And we need to be working together on that, and we need to figure out our way forward. And so I'm always just leaning into our plant relatives and the lessons that they share with us, which is that they are telling us that diversity is the root of our resilience. And in our movements, we need to cultivate as much diversity as possible, because we're all, we're all suffering under these oppressive systems. So I could go on and on, but I'll leave it at that.
Just want to do that off me, because that's amazing.
Yeah, it makes me think about solidarity and how it's frustrated. And one of the things I've been thinking about lately has been the colonization of our grief, that we haven't reached a point of understanding the collective nature of our grief. And I think about how, Jewish people who experienced the violence of Nazism and the Holocaust will uplift the 6 million people who died in the Holocaust, but in fact, it was 16 million, upwards of 16 million, with 10 million Slavs, and so many Roma people from my same ancestral line, and queer, transgender, gay people, elders, chronically ill people. There were so many people who died, but to section off a piece of it and go, well, this here is special. and it was targeted, but there were many different targets. And so when we make our grief special, it allows us to keep conducting the kinds of violence we're seeing today. Like, our grief is special, so we have to guard against ongoing violence to ourselves by creating more violence for others. I think of that with some of the dynamics I'm in conversation with around the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of scholars don't see that as a part of settler colonialism. Well, there were people who had to work those plantations. And the whole model of plantation farming is what uprooted indigenous systems of farming. So people were farming to pay the taxes for the colonial overlords, as opposed to farming and tending the lands that they've been tending for many years. And so when we make our grief special, we actually limit the way we can collectively grieve. That what happened on this land, I'm here because the same violence happened in my homeland. That's why I am here. That's why I'm so far away from those trees and the smells of my ancestral homelands. And so once we can understand that, the pain of what's happening in Palestine right now hurts so deep for all of us. But that is the entry point, I feel, for building a kind of solidarity that can start to move the resistance. And so, Manal, I'm wondering if you'll share with us some of the things that we're asking folks to do coming up as we look at starvation in Gaza and how we can resist.
Yes, so we will be starting a campaign this Friday, Hungry for Ceasefire, and it will be a rolling hunger strike that will be launching with the Do No Harm Coalition, where we are getting healthcare workers to go on a hunger strike. And we will be having much more information, so please check out the Do No Harm Coalition Instagram page for that. A lot of people have been asking where to send donations. I just wanted to give a few organizations that are working right now in Gaza, specifically the Palestine Children Relief Fund, Middle East Children's Alliance, and we have Kinder, Kinder, as well as Anera. So those are some of the ones that are internationally known and respected, who have people in the ground who can help. Also, the Palestinian American Medical Association, they are doing some drives to send medical supplies to the region. I wanted to ask Rupa, do we have a few minutes, or will this end exactly at 2?
Oh, I think we're good. I think we're okay.
We have a few minutes. Okay,
Wrap
so
it up. Yeah.
I just
I think Reem also said that she does have to have a hard stop, so just honoring that. Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to. Let me wait. Reem, do you have a hard stop at 2:00? Okay.
I do.
Okay, any last comments? Just wanted to thank you, and a way of just celebrating our culture, celebrating our food, using food as medicine. Any last words?
Yeah, I feel like Rowan brought it home with the interconnection. I just feel really blessed that we're in a moment of history where we can learn from you all, and I continue to be inspired. I mean, we've also seen in history that empire falls when the mass movement happens, and we're seeing it. And I think if there's just one concrete thing that people can do when thinking about food as it relates to Palestine is like really thinking about where you invest your money. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has been longstanding here in the US. I mean, globally, right? But here in the US, there are a lot of products that are Israeli owned that we can be boycotting. And there's the BNS website has a lot of those products, but also just like asking questions when you see something that's like, this looks Palestinian. Asking the hard questions of, is this food being appropriated, and challenging the status quo there. But also investing in Palestinian-owned businesses for sure.
Thank you so much, Reem. Thank you for joining us. We want to respect your time. We'll stay on for just a few minutes. Just as a reminder, we wanted to talk probably a little bit more about food as medicine, but I do think we got the gist of that during this conversation. As a reminder, as a healer, I always think of our body is like this vehicle that is getting us through this journey of life, and our sustenance is our food amongst so many other things. And because we've been so far removed from the process of growing our own food, not just in Gaza, right, even locally here, I'm grateful, Rowen, for the work that you do, and so much that you shared with us, and also Rupa with your Deep Medicine Circle, of how we can connect to that as a form of healing, because we are seeing the proliferation of so much chronic disease, because we're becoming forcibly removed from these processes, because when there are people who are benefiting financially, right? And so it is a part of this system that continues to keep us in bad health at the end of the day. And so when we talk about chronic disease, the new term is like disease regression. We can make diabetes go away. We know that now. Once upon a time, and Rupa, I'm sure you too, we used to tell our diabetic patients, oh, once you have diabetes, and we're talking about type 2, it's never going to go away, but we can get it controlled. But we don't say that anymore. Now we say, hey, do you know that, if you eat real food and you're able to move and increase your physical activity and socialize and be with people and find connection and community and sleep, you can make your diabetes go away. And that's a beautiful thing to be able to say as a physician, where there's so many conditions where we never thought we could say those things. And I think I would like to end on that note as a reminder for everyone to really think of food as medicine. And everyone's coming from a different background, but just, whether it's growing something in your garden or supporting those who do, or learning more about your ancestral foods, and really going back to eating real food. So from the earth, from the tree, and if you choose animals, it's a different story, but focusing more on that. So thank you everyone for being here and joining us. And I'll go ahead, Rupa and Rowen, if you'd like anything to add.
Yeah.
I'd like to add something, which is that in terms of what folks can do to sort of move forward from here. I mean, there's so many ways. You've shared a lot of them, but I also think this is a movement for all of us to reconnect in meaningful ways to our ancestral food traditions as a means to embody the indigenous part of ourselves that we all have somewhere deep. I always say that there's nobody untouched by the countless layers of diaspora and the grief that brings to all of us, right? And so I came back to food and farming and seed keeping as an act of resilience and resistance and intergenerational trauma healing. Like it has helped me heal the layers of colonial trauma in my body. And every day that I'm in my garden, it is a love poem to the world that says that that we are not a conquered people, right? And the last thing I want to say to that is that I read this quote from this publication online called Witness to Gaza. And there was a quote in there and it says, only then will you know that every time you cook your traditional food, you are resuscitating something inside of you that they could never kill, right? And so that is such a powerful statement that we have to continue to try, no matter what it is that they do, to continue to stay connected to the land and to the seed in whatever way we can, even if it's in a little pot on our apartment balcony, to maintain those spiritual and cultural connections that all of us have, those agreements that we have to those seeds and plants, because that is saying to the world that they could not kill that part of us. And that is, a resounding act of resistance in these times. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rowen, and thank you, Manal. I think that when I think of, like, for example, with diabetes, I've really now understood it as a structural disease. So while we can help our patients as individuals, I do believe that the medicine needs to happen on the structural level. So when you mention, if you eat well and you have access to whole food and you can cook and you can sleep, those are all things that are made very hard to do by the structures we live in. And so engaging the politics of refusal, as Rowen was talking about, that the works of resistance are also works of building the new world, building the world that's on her way, inviting her to be here with us. And through the work of planting those seeds and watching them grow and connecting and tending to land and supporting other people being able to do that in the face of such tremendous violence is so important. So thank you for being here, everybody. And thank you, Manal. Do you want to close us out?
Everything's perfectly said so far. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Your time is precious, and we appreciate that you spent it with us today. Thank you, and please follow Do No Harm Coalition for future events. And I guess one last thing, people are asking what can be done locally. Please reach out to a local elected official. That's kind of the least we can do. And, you know, we're all doing our best to raise awareness, not just about Palestine, but all Indigenous struggles and so many more. Thank you so much.